Hello, I'm Pastor Nanette Christofferson, and along with Pastor Steve Talmadge, we offer these short Bible studies on our lectionary readings. This week we are in Pentecost 5 of Lectionary Year A, and our Old Testament reading continues on from last week in Jeremiah. Well, not exactly continues on, but it is in the same book and from the same prophet. And this week we study Jeremiah 28, verses 5 through 9. Let's go back and let's just take a little review on some of the history that was going on at the time of Jeremiah the prophet. We can look at the geopolitical climate, and we can see of the 7th and 6th century BCE was a very difficult time for Israel, as the Babylonian Empire was getting ready to take over Judah and eventually Jerusalem. Jeremiah was a prophet who spoke into that time and addressed the king of Judah with difficult words from God. I think I'd like us to stop and consider a question. I don't have questions at the end of this video like I normally do. I'm just kind of incorporating the questions in as we go along. So I'd like us to think about Jeremiah's prophecies, and they took place over 2,500 years ago. And as we go through this study, do you think that these words ring true in our world today? So kind of hold that in your thought as you think about prophets, as you think about our world today. And maybe we don't think we hear from prophets, but we do. We have plenty of voices that we listen to that can be prophetic. Whether they're prophetic voices from God or not, that might be a different decision to make. Let's look at prophets in the Old Testament, and really prophets in the time of the Old Testament before Christ was born. And prophets were a part of the king's court, and not only just king's courts in Israel, but king's courts all over the empire, the Syrian Empire. Kings oftentimes had prophets. So it wasn't unusual for kings to have prophets around them. And they often had circles of prophets. So there was like the inner circle of prophets that were very close to the king. And then there were oftentimes the outer circle of prophets that might not be so close to the king, but would oftentimes speak out against the king. They didn't often have the king's ear, like those who delivered good news messages to the kings. So we can look at the kings definitely, right? If you're king, aren't you going to favor the prophets that tell you the things you want to hear? And those prophets generally benefited, right? Socioeconomically, because the kings would then pay them greatly because of the news they delivered. But the prophets that did not deliver good news, well, oftentimes the kings didn't like to pay attention to them. But the prophets that were from God were generally different than the prophets that were part of the inner circle of the king. They were not always favored in the high courts. They spoke the words of the Lord, which oftentimes were harsh, and words that leaders did not want to hear. Many times they would be thrown out of that inner circle had they even had the opportunity to be a part of it. As we look to Jeremiah, we see that he proclaimed a message with implications for all of Judah and for everyone in Jerusalem. Jeremiah was a witness to the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem. He proclaimed the coming Babylonian invasion of Judah and God's judgment and encouraged the people to submit to it. He paid a high price for such preaching. I just want you to think for a minute. What's it like when you might be part of a group and you bring to them words that perhaps they don't want to hear? You're not agreeing with them in a way. So many times we do not even like the challenge of someone who might disagree with what we're thinking. So let's look at prophets again, as they offer a hard word to hear. Prophets tend to have a deep understanding of the systemic nature of injustice. Prophets understand the economic injustices and a deep sense of awareness of communal sin and communal responsibility. Now, these are the prophets of God. Unfortunately, in our world today, with our sense of individualism, we often do not want to take on this awareness. Instead, we say, I didn't do that. That's not my problem. And so I'd like us to wonder as we listen to this video today, I wonder how Mesa, Arizona would change if we were willing to take on this communal responsibility. As we look to Jeremiah, along with other prophets, he recognized the industrial religious complex that had power, who used people at the expense of their power. So these prophets rise up and they speak truth to power. And that this religious structure that appears so powerful is actually just a house of cards that can come tumbling down at any minute. And prophets are not intimidated by those powers. Some are endlessly scorned, but they are not intimidated. Jeremiah claims he has no choice but to speak out. So let's read Jeremiah 28, 5 through 9. It's an interesting scene we have here because Jeremiah is speaking towards one way of God's way, but another prophet, Hananiah, is also speaking and telling the people a different way. Then the prophet Jeremiah spoke to the prophet Hananiah in the presence of the priests and all the people who were standing in the house of the Lord. And the prophet Jeremiah said, Amen. May the Lord do so. May the Lord fulfill the words that you have prophesied and bring back to this place from Babylon the vessels of the house of the Lord and all of the exiles. But listen now to this word that I speak in your hearing and in the hearing of all people. The prophets who preceded you and me from ancient times prophesied war, famine, and pestilence against many countries and great kingdoms. As for the prophet who prophesies peace, when the word of that prophet comes true, then it will be known that the Lord has truly sent the prophet. So let's set the scene here. One prophet, Jeremiah, tells the people the truth. The other prophet, Hananiah, tells the people what they want to hear. One appears to us as the brave preacher who endures scorn for speaking the word of the Lord, the word of the Lord gave him. The other appears to us as the one who wants to please, because he offers near-term hope. If you were in that audience of that day, I wonder which prophet you would believe. Maybe you would want to believe Jeremiah because you can hear some words of truth in that. But perhaps because Hananiah's truth seems easier to hear and gives you what you want for hope, you would look to Hananiah for the answers. So we cannot know what was going on in Hananiah's head. Did he honestly believe that he preached a word from God? Did he succumb to the temptation to preach the popular word? Did he convince himself that the voice in his own head was the word from God? Well, we can't really answer these questions. We could make assumptions into them. But I'd like you to stop and think, have you in your field of work ever softened what you knew you should be saying? While it's easier to wonder what Hananiah wanted, we can far too easily find ourselves judging Hananiah, perhaps unfairly. So when have you ever in your field of work softened what you knew you should be saying? I think we can all think of experiences where we have softened some of the things that we know there will be people that don't want to hear something, and it's softened for them so that maybe it will come across in a gentler way. Perhaps even in our relationships, we've done that as well. So who are the people to believe, Hananiah or Jeremiah? We are able to see this passage in a unique way as we are able to listen to both Hananiah and Jeremiah. Each prophet interprets the events of history differently. The scene happens after the initial attack on Jerusalem in 597 BCE by the Babylonians, but before the devastation of 587. The people do not know what to think or to do. Hananiah offers a word that sounds like hope. He advises resistance, trusting that Judah can shake off the attack of the Babylonians. The sense of defeat will only last 2 years. We as the reader can see the dilemma. Doesn't trust in God mean that God will take care and be on our side? Won't God fight for us and against our enemies? Hananiah gives the people a plan and inspires them to resist the encroachment of the Babylonians. His message sounds strong and energizing. But we look to Jeremiah and we see that Jeremiah has a different story. Jeremiah tells the people to accept what has happened. He tells them to prepare for a long time of exile. His famous words in this next chapter sound expectant to our ears. This is in Jeremiah chapter 29, where he says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce, in verse 5. If we remember, this chapter also starts off with, I know the plans I have for you. And so that's words of encouragement too to them. But the words are sounding like planning for the future prosperity. They sound like taking responsibility and embracing life. To the original audience, they sounded like resignation. Jeremiah counseled accepting defeat and making the best of it. Jeremiah believed that God would act again, but not soon. He taught the people to make the best of a bad situation, but not to try to get out of it. That message sounds passive and even weak. We now know, of course, that Jeremiah, not Hananiah, spoke the word that came from the Lord. I think all of us have problems waiting for a word from God. We all at times lack the patience that we need to have when God might be telling us, not yet, and all our instinct or words of advice that we receive say, go now, do this now. So even with our hindsight about this particular passage in the life of Judah, we do not always know which prophet speaks the truth today. Jeremiah sets out the criteria for true prophecy. Which prophet accurately predicts what will happen? The problem comes in realizing that the people couldn't just simply wait to see what would happen in 2 years. They needed to decide whose advice to follow. Do they practice acceptance and wait for God to act later? Or do they plan for resistance? They had to make a choice now. If we change the context from war and invasion to injustice, we can see the dilemma Jeremiah sets up for us. Martin Luther King Jr. entitled one of his books, Why We Can't Wait. The title referred to the advice of comfortable people who told King and the rest of the civil rights warriors that racial justice would happen in time. The advice reflected the complacent stance that the king and others were trying to rush too fast. Jeremiah counsels waiting, settling in uncomfortably in Babylonian power. Simply accepting and adjusting to the status quo can come at too high a price. Sometimes the Christian response means not accepting the status quo. So which one was right? Yet in certain situations, we look to learning to build a house in the last place you want to live requires courage and faith. A single parent raising children after the death of a spouse, the adjustment to a handicapping condition that will never respond to treatment, a sudden drop in income that market forces will not fix. Jeremiah's stance demonstrates the importance of recognizing those circumstances, which requires wisdom, discernment, and ignoring the voice in our head that tells us what we want to hear. When do we settle in and accept what life has given us? When do we resist and throw off the shackles of the life we don't want or deserve? In some contemporary situations, Hananiah's advice to resist is the more faithful response. In other situations, Jeremiah's counsel of acceptance becomes the word from the Lord. Jeremiah and Hananiah set those choices before us. As I think of these choices, I often think of how this both and can work, right? We can look at one way was the right way for that space and time, but another set of advice might be the right way for that particular space and time. The hardest part is the discernment and really seeking what does God want in the heart of God instead of our own. So my resources came from a commentary by Charles L. Aaron Jr. I also used Text Week, David Lose's commentary, and Rob Bell had an interesting podcast, Till No Space is Left. You might want to look that up on the internet, and it's from June 1, 2020. I pray that all of you have a chance this week to think about Jeremiah, Hananiah, to think about the Babylonian empire and what it might be like to be under the constraints of rulers that don't accept your faith. And I hope that you have some time to meditate on the word this week. God's blessings to you in your journey.